We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish the Constitution for the United States of America. It's interesting when you look at the preamble what it actually states it's there to do versus where we currently are.
I know. I just sort of glommed onto the general welfare, and that is put your mask on, get vaccinated.
So thinking about the just context of the preamble to the Constitution and the idea of what the Constitution set out to achieve, I mean, it's pretty clear the Founding Fathers meant to create an environment that was quote-unquote more perfect than previous iterations. And in doing so, one of the general guiding principles is the focus on the well-being of its citizens across the board. Contrast that to recent activities, recent being over whatever short time frame between a month and 4 years that you would like to choose. And it's kind of clear that the ideas the nation was founded upon are not the ideas that we are currently focused on.
Yeah, and all of us out here would like to think that we can read a document like that and feel like, oh yeah, I know exactly what they intended, and because it's what I want. And we have constitutional scholars and judges that spend a lot of time focusing on each word, deciphering that, and working through and making sure that they don't understep the bounds of the Constitution. But I think what some people forget is that we're not limited to the Constitution. Yes, we want to make sure that we maintain a certain set of freedoms, but this government was created to reinvent itself and evolve. And it was created in such a way that it was designed to keep various individuals or groups of individuals from getting too much power. There are checks and balances.
And I would say we've seen those checks and balances break down to a certain extent over the past few years. Well, more than few years, but especially the most recent few years.
Well, but that being said, I'm also somewhat encouraged when we had, who to date, the worst president our country's ever seen, have various lawsuits that he's brought before the courts struck down with three of his own appointed judges. So that feels a little bit okay.
Well, I would say across the board, the judicial system has been more functional than the others. So what I was referencing specifically was that Congress has become a failure of what it is there to represent and do.
Right.
And so the executive and legislative branches are very problematic in a number of different ways. So far, the judicial branch has relatively functioned as designed as it should. And the only reason I kind of hesitate a little bit there is because a few of the decisions don't seem to be based around strict adherence to interpretation of constitutional law, and maybe seem to swing kind of ideological in one way or another. but it's difficult to say that as someone who is not well versed in constitutional law, right? It's one of those things where I look at it and it seems a little fuzzy to me, just as someone trying to objectively pick it apart. But I accept it because I recognize that that's not my specialty. Well, I accept it because I have to. I can't exactly overrule the Supreme Court. But I accept it at face value to an extent, because it may very well be something that those more versed in understanding the Constitution and law as a whole recognize should be X or Y, whatever the decision may be. So there's a little bit of just acknowledgement that that is not an area that I know well enough to form an argument against.
So as I understand it, the power that the judicial system and really the Supreme Court has is relatively new, maybe less than 100 years old. And I'm going to oversimplify and dumb down, but basically they went from sort of nerds being in the corner that were, used here and there to a fairly powerful entity that has a lot more influence in law than previously or historically has had. So I'll see if I can find some resources to point someone in. I don't think that I have the full information to go into the detail as to why, and there are plenty of other podcasts that do. But that being said, they feel like they are the least corrupt branch of our federal government.
And adding to that, it also feels like part of why they have become more prolific in the public eye is also just the sheer evolution of things that bring issues to our attention and therefore bring challenges to issues. Because if you think about the purpose of the court, it is, the Supreme Court specifically, so the concept of the judicial branch at the federal level is to maintain that the actions of the other branches remain constitutional. And a lot of the things that we are seeing are built into the appeals process, where it goes from lower level courts up through the system to due process of law and adjudication of courts or cases. But a number of cases are in that gray area where you can make a argument against what rights are provided the person who initially brought the case before the courts versus the opposition. And so a lot of things feel like it's just the natural evolution of things being more public, more visible than maybe they would have been prior. And so therefore those things are brought to the courts more often than they would have been previously as well.
I wish I could give more detail from the thoughts that I'm having, but I just don't remember the details. But I believe there were some pivotal cases or a pivotal time where the members of the Supreme Court interpreted the law and interpreted the Constitution in such a way that gave them a lot more power than they previously had.
Certainly entirely possible. I can just also see the difference between what was easily seen or discovered in the eye of the public previously versus how easy it is to see a lot of different things now, just as the result of the proliferation of mass communication.
That doesn't hurt. And this is I mean, I think this is relatively new, and it came about once we had technologies that allowed for mass communication, such as radio and television.
Yeah, so the overall, I guess, thesis or thought that kind of brings us to is how do we shift so much in how we approach the not even how we approach, how we understand and work within the party system as it stands today versus the combination of what the founding fathers set out to achieve, what they explicitly stated, and contextually brought forth. I don't even have a good way to wrap up that statement. It's just so all-encompassing and consuming and hypocritical between now and the way things started that it's just tough to kind of wrap a statement around.
I think I know. And when I say I think I know, I mean I know what you mean. I feel like
it's real easy to take a step back and look at the different points of failure of policy or action, but it's difficult to step back further from that and look at what has made the trend line, for lack of better terminology, go from this upper ideal of creating a society that was generally desiring the betterment of its citizens to a focus on power grabbing. And that's really all I have. Like, how else could you describe the current functioning of most aspects of the political landscape other than attempted power grabs?
Yeah, but that leads me to think that maybe we're not really experiencing new problems. Like, these seem to be the same problems that have plagued American politics for the past always. And certainly sometimes we're better, and we have, I don't want to say that we have a more complex society and we have more complex problems, because I don't think we do. I think we have a whole different set of complexities than society did 100 years ago and 200 years ago. And some may say that the shrinking of the world through, telecommunication has created a certain level of complexity that the people 100 years ago didn't have. But it was like, well, yeah, they didn't have that complexity, but they had the complexity of not being able to communicate to the other side of the world for days, weeks, months. So different complexity. So what I do see, and that is from historical reference, is that we have made progress. We've made liberal progress. It's not as hard as it is to be a black man driving down the road today. It's not quite as hard as it was 50 years ago. And 150 years ago, in a lot of places, it wasn't even allowed. Are we where we want to be? Absolutely not. Have we taken a step back? More than likely. But are we still moving forward? I think so. And I think every generation moves forward. We don't have the luxury of living hundreds of years to know what kind of progress that we've made in a more tangible way.
That's a fair assessment. I think the thing that still feels problematic is that going back to Hamilton and Madison and Jefferson versus the different transitions over the course of the years and even today.
Going back to them from last show.
Yeah. Generally speaking, the trend in politics as a whole has been a party of specific plans or thoughts or ideals or actions or desired outcomes, and an opposition party for no better reason than to be an opposition party. And if that's the case, while we may have made progress at a societal level to some extent, we haven't made any progress at a governmental functioning level at all.
Maybe not. I can't disagree with your statement. I can't, because it certainly feels that way, and it certainly feels like we're farther behind in that regard. But there's somebody over there doing something, right? Or are we just coasting on the last bit of good work that was done the last time something good was done?
Well, I think that's the big part that makes it feel so poignant currently, is that it's difficult to see good work out of the previous administration. And so it's difficult to see where the dust settles and how things move forward when certain aspects of the previous administration's talking points are still prevalent. Because it still feels obstructionist. I mean, that's kind of what it boils down to in a nutshell.
Well, so the Obama administration, we had, the Republican Party was set out to be an obstructionist party, and as a result, they're probably tearing themselves apart from within. That's yet to be seen. And all of that feels bad. The Democratic Party, as an obstructionist party to the Trump administration, felt like a necessary evil. I don't like the idea of the party being an obstructionist party, but there was very little that the Trump's Republican Party wanted to do that was in agreement with the Democratic Party, at least on position. I don't know what the voting record shows. They might have agreed to vote on 75% of the same stuff. So I don't know. But do we want to look at both parties and say, hey, why don't you try to work it out? Do we get a thing that we need? I think
that's necessary from the standpoint of what politics is meant to be, right? But I don't think it's as simple as that going forward.
Well, I think I think you're right. I think in this country, there's such fundamental differences between where the left is and where the right is that we're seeing more and more obstruction or obstructionist parties because there's not an opportunity for bipartisanship.
Well, and here's where I argue that a little bit. There's too much extremism that is not based on fact in the political arena currently. And backing that up a little bit, I'm talking about things like the big lie, quote unquote, election fraud, QAnon conspiracy theories, like things that are demonstrably incorrect and inaccurate and misinformation, and yet you still have people holding elected office positions of, to an extent, power, spreading the same information as though it is fact over and over and over and over and over. And so I don't think that the idea of compromise in the political arena is the problem. I think the Trump effect, for lack of better phrasing, of if I just repeat it enough, people are going to believe it, is the problem. So if you take that thought and extrapolate that to, I'm not quote unquote playing or being a part of the political game anymore, I am organizing or creating a following of people who believe this idea, regardless of factual basis, in order to maintain or improve my position. That's a deal breaker. It creates an environment that is 100% not expected by the founding fathers, I would assume, just based on context of everything that was written. And two, it breaks the idea of the system that was created, thought through, rationalized, because it relies on fact and logical thought. And the current system relies on emotional response and irrational thought.
What do we do?
Well, I don't have the answers. I mean, it's a fundamental break of the system.
Well, is it a break of the system, or is it? I mean, it's a.
Well, I would call it a fundamental break, because the system relies on rational thought and understanding. It relies on an engaged citizenry to be a part of the process. It relies on fact from position of authority. It relies on the spreading of knowledge from an objective, unbiased source. And we have none of those things. None.
Yeah.
Name a single unbiased source.
You can't.
That could give you details on political.
That's gone away.
And you certainly can't tell me that we have an engaged citizenry that is attempting to actually understand the actions of the political parties.
We have the opposite of that.
Like this is why I have concerns about the future of what it means to be, really just the future of the existence of government as we know it, but the future of what it means to have a two-party idealized system and not a very strict, robust set of rules around what can and can't be done.
Well, the next 20 years is going to be very telling.
I can only hope we get back to the ideas that actually existed with the founding fathers. And I'm not wanting to, I want to clarify, I'm not putting the founding fathers up on a pedestal either, because they also had their problems. But they did have a very clear set of ideas and philosophies about creating a better place to live.
Yeah, I think the issue there, we could argue that what they defined as better was not exactly better for everybody that was here. So very much so. And some of the concessions in the original creation of the government were the unification of differing ideas and the concessions that you would expect from politics. I mean, if you look at it, there were folk, they created a system, they created a government that allowed for the eventual breaking of that, or the eventual remedy of those concessions. I mean, we're still feeling the ramifications of it today, some of us more than others, but
yeah. And I mean, taking it just a step further, there were some things written into, or there were some timelines written into the formation of the country as well, that you can see the idea being We can't do it today, but we know we can revisit it in the future and try to correct it. That again goes back to understanding the context of the day and the power struggles between the various people, or the various stakeholders, maybe a better way to put it. Doesn't excuse it. There are plenty of things that we can point to as being bad from the outset, but there's a difference between what can I do today versus what can I find a way to remedy in the future, because in the short term, this has to change or we're just completely gone, the survival of the idea sometimes has to outweigh the individual in a lot of different ways. We talk about it from the abstract of the needs of the society outweighs the individual. That's not necessarily great for the individual, and it's especially not great for the individual when the individual is a group of individuals and not just a singular individual. But there is a point where you have to choose between a larger group in scope and a smaller group in scope, and unfortunately, those choices happen in every society over time, and eventually the goal is to not have those definitions of group and scope.
Right. And also part of that is that if we've done something that is difficult for that smaller group of individuals, we can also work on compensating for that. We have the ability and the power and the resources to do so. So let that not be forgotten. I kind of think about this time that we're going through, and time will tell that whether or not this was a blip on the radar and a temporary setback or not. I recall, I was thinking about there's a lot of things that European governments have just moved into and gotten past, and we seem to be still struggling with. And I remember this idea that, European governments are, hundreds and hundreds of years old. Like some of them thousands of years old, or at least the European countries are thousands of years old. And there's been society on Europe and Asia for millennia now. And the United States is a relatively young country, and it could be that we're still in our growing pains. Maybe we're, because of the nature of the world, maybe the 200 and are we getting to be 250 years old? Or
Yeah, we're close. We're close to 250.
Yeah, we're 245 this year.
Which just really just goes back to emphasize that, yes, we are a very young country in the grand scheme of things. There are very few countries younger.
Right. We might be in our adolescence, and Donald J. Trump might be just a little pimple that we had to pop. I needed to get there so I could refer to him that way.
I understand. We and I think the biggest thing is for a lot of us, that's the uneasy question. It's I can navigate things currently, and I know what I want to get to just because of my desire to see, a more just and equitable world. But especially as you reach the point of having kids and looking at the trajectory that we've made, that's where you really, I think, start to second guess a lot of things. Because it's no longer about what can you stomach or deal with for whatever amount of time you have left. Like the pessimist in me, thinks that I have less than however many years that I've lived currently, right? So the idea that my timeline is at least in its waning years, I'm not going to see a lot more change. If I'm lucky, I'll, get more years than I currently have, but that's a whole different story. But having a son at this point really makes me concerned about what he's going to see. And so I think that's what makes this a more uneasy situation in general, is that it's no longer about the finite scale of my timeline. It's about the less finite scale from a mental clarity perspective of my timeline plus at least one other, if not more, beyond that. And how can I affect 3, 4, 5 generations down today? Like, I think that's where the uneasiness comes from, because you can see a potential diverging point of we could take from today and go this direction and have a positive outcome, or we can take the lessons or what we've seen of the past few years and say that maybe that's not a blip and we have this other trajectory and outcome. And that's not a world I want future generations living in.
I kind of have a different take.
I would like to hear it.
And, well, the take that I have is, like, I think about the greatest generation. Those for you and me, that would be our grandparents. And they've all but a few have left us. And their children, the boomers, the baby boomers, are starting to go where they've gone. And a lot of the problems that I feel we see with let me say this, I'm working on how I want to word this, but the right-leaning voters, fundamentalists, tend to be a part of that generation. And I'm sort of unclear exactly where Generation X stands. And, true to form, they just kind of seem like,
They're all over the place.
Are they?
I have no definitive data to back this up, but just based on anecdotal observation, Gen X and that transitionary sub-generation between X and Y, and even the beginnings of Y, there's so much change that occurred across the board that it's difficult to narrow down that subset of years from any type of ideological leanings, because they're all over the place.
They also don't, there's also, the stereotype is that they don't care. This, the oldest Gen Xers are the parents of the youngest millennials, or Gen Y, as you call them.
Yeah, I hate using the term millennial.
Well, yeah, millennials came up with the term because they didn't want to be called Gen Y, so, which is...
Yeah, I get it. I understand it.
Well, it could not be more millennial.
Well, and it couldn't be more Gen X of me than to call it Gen Y either.
Absolutely. But you're on the tail end. You're on the tail end of Gen X, and I'm at the very beginning of the millennial generation. So it's, we probably have more overlap with each other than the other end of our generations. Anyway, that being said, it feels like, like, to give a metaphor, millennials are arguing with boomers, and Gen X are, like, having a beer over in the corner, just, watching them duke it out. That being said, if the data were to reflect that Gen X was all over the map, as the baby boomer generation pass, and more, well, we can go ahead and say that at this point, if millennials went out and voted, they would, be the largest voting demographic by generation in the country. And they tend to, millennials tend to be a lot more liberal than their parents. And then Gen Z is even more liberal than them, which would be, I guess, maybe the majority of Gen X children would be Gen Z. And then our children are in Generation Alpha, and who the hell knows what they're going to be like? Probably even more liberal. So it could be that we're about to get over a hump, and when the government is being run by Generation X, Generation Y, and Generation Z, we might see a lot more progress. I might be stupidly optimistic here. I tend to be. But we may be on the cusp of something very interesting.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say that one of the generational traits for X that is obviously present is a more pessimistic view of potential outcomes. It's not an attempt to view it that way, but more a ramification of the mindset of if I expect this outcome that is worse than what I hope for or what I want, then at least I'm not surprised by it, which is very much a cultural dynamic of how Gen X approaches things in general.
Right. They give us grunge music, for crying out loud.
Right. Well, it has been preached for forever, expect the worst and hope for the best. And that's not really what we do in general. We expect the worst. Sure, we can hope for the best, but we don't think the best is going to happen. We're aiming for that middle ground so that it's not the worst thing that could happen and we're at least pleasantly surprised. It's more of it's an adaptation to the idea that if we prepare for this bad scenario, we don't necessarily expect the bad scenario to happen, but at least we're not surprised by it. And that mindset permeates a lot about how Gen X approaches things, and it's why you have the stereotype of Gen X sitting in a corner just drinking a beer or whatever, observing battles, because we've prepared for this worst case scenario. What you're providing is actually not the worst case scenario, so we're okay with it. Like, proceed, keep going. We'll figure it out. It's more of a mindset of roll with it, and as long as it doesn't hit this bottom of the barrel point, we're okay. We'll survive. We know there's a better outcome eventually.
Right. If what you give me is better than what I'm expecting, it doesn't matter how bad reality is because I was expecting worse.
Correct.
And one of the reasons I think maybe we have a hump to get over and we're on the cusp of something interesting happening is that baby boomers are kind of the last generation, and maybe the older Gen X. I think you certainly fit in with as part of the generation, or on the side of a generation that watched a huge amount of change. Like, technologically, the world changed in our childhood, especially in the latter part of our formative years. And everybody younger than us, or a lot of them younger than us, don't even remember a time when things didn't end with .com. And I think that might be a big thing. Like, I remember hearing once that tradition is something that a baby boomer did twice, which is the exact opposite of not just being able to adapt with change, but being okay with change or even inviting change, because change can mean something better. And last episode, I talked to, when we were talking about, in God we trust and adding under God to the Pledge of Allegiance, I mentioned that was a post-war world where people were seeking safety and met expectations, and dullness or blandness or, just, a lack of surprise. Like, a lack of surprise was, we just want to go to our job. We want to come home. We want to have a martini, and we don't want to be surprised with, air raid sirens. So the ability to adapt is difficult for our parents' generation, and I think that plays a huge factor in making advancement in social liberties and justice, allowing black folks to hold positions that they'd never held before, not keeping them down, treating them as equals, understanding that how I look is not how I identify. I don't want to identify as anything. You don't have to understand that. That's a really hard thing for them to grasp, because they grew up not being asked to do that. They were asked to, stay in line and do what's expected of you. Don't make any waves.
So for clarification purposes, there's a general argument to be made for a subgeneration that exists between Gen X and Millennial. I refuse to state the name because it's the most millennial thing that I've heard, and I am a little more Gen X than I am Millennial, but I do fall squarely in that transitory subgeneration.
Xenial with his X.
Yeah, whatever.
I had the exact same.
Yeah. So
it's not discussed. I'm just like, really,
yeah,
guys?
it's more a matter
Really?
of it just doesn't make sense, or you couldn't be more creative, or
No. See, like, the idea of this subgeneration does make sense because of the shift in technology. Like
I'm not arguing against the idea of subgeneration. I'm arguing against the naming. Like, you couldn't be more creative than saying Xenial. Come on.
They thought they were being clever.
Yeah, they were being dumb and lazy. I had to say it that way just because of the stereotypes. Go ahead.
I know. But yeah. I mean, it's an interesting thing because, like, there are, again, you and I are right at that transition where it's like, I wasn't sure if I was considered Generation X or a millennial, and I took a quiz. It felt like a BuzzFeed quiz, and I want to give BuzzFeed credit for it, but I know it was definitely on the New York Times website. And I was born in 1981, and they told me that based on my answers, I was an old millennial with good taste in music.
I think the latter part's very objective.
Well, yeah, but
the
music scene was very interesting in the 90s. So
I haven't taken any specific quiz, but I can very clearly see that I identify a lot with Gen X on certain subjects and topics and ideas, and I identify a lot with millennials on similar, certain subjects, topics, ideas. And I recognize, because of my general background understanding societal constructs, that I don't fit in either category exclusively. And there are many like me who do not fit in one category or the other. And so this idea of a subgeneration that helps bridge the gap makes a lot of sense. But it goes back to our need to label something to understand it. That is, it's good in this case because it helps me understand why I don't fit into this group that I'm supposed to fit into. But it's also bad that I have to have a label to understand it.
No, the label. I feel like sometimes the label is there. Like, if I know what the label is and you know what the label is, we can just use the label and realize that we have shared knowledge. So,
well, I mean, that's the whole point of labels.
Right, I know.
The problem,
I know.
though, is that if I were to only identify as this subgeneration label, and I were talking to people who did not understand this concept of a transitory subgeneration, and you only had Gen X and then Millennial, well, there's a problem. We have no shared common ground to be able to understand why I am saying there's a problem with me picking one or the other, even though I've technically fall in Gen X because I was born in 79.
Right.
And so it does, while it's good, it is why we have labels. It's also bad because it requires an understanding of the fluidity of labels and why they can't be binary. And that is the part that most people don't recognize and understand.
Right. It's the inherent problem with labels. You don't know how educated the other person is unless you've had, multiple conversations with them. And maybe then, who knows? But like I said, I said earlier in this show that I was just like, you and I probably have far more in common with than those on the other end of our respective generations. Because based on years, I am one of the first millennials. You're one of the last Gen X, but we tend to have more in common, and which that's why they created, that's why they describe this subgeneration. And I don't want to say it's unlikely that we'll see other subgenerations, but it's clear to me that not every in between, not every gap of generations is going to have a distinct or as distinct a subgeneration as that we have. And so
and it's interesting that most of the reason for that distinction is the sheer pace of advancement of technology and how it proliferated life as we knew it.
Yeah. I was watching a period piece television show that was based on it ran the majority of it was based in the mid to late 80s with a lot of flashbacks, but nothing. Maybe one or two scenes made it as far as 1991, but it's just like 1991 versus 1985. There wasn't a lot different with how business was conducted. And I just kept thinking, it was like, oh my God, the sheer amount of like paperwork that they had to do, because they had to read papers and the stuff was on the computer, and like none of us like. There are no papers in my in my work life. It's all electronic. There's nothing on paper. Like there's that's a huge shift. And neither one of us, by the time either of us were in college, I did everything on a word processor. Like I didn't have to use word processing, software. I did not have to use a typewriter or word processor like hardware machine.
It's actually very interesting. I used a typewriter in middle school, maybe even early high school, and then transitioned to word processing software in high school. And I had to go back and forth occasionally because there were certain classes where the requirement was typed, not printed, for some strange reason. And that can be a whole separate, argument. But
at that point, it was discretionary for the teacher, maybe the department, but it was very much a shift in the late 90s, and I didn't have a single class that required anything typed, like properly typed on a typewriter. I did have a professor that specified a font and a size and a spacing that was really close to what a typewriter looked like.
Yeah, I can only imagine that maybe part of that was the transition between understanding how easy it was to copy and paste from other sources into a word processor. So some level of attempting to combat plagiarism as other methods were being figured out just because of the time of the transition. I don't feel like there was anything specific about the difference between typed paper and printed paper. I think it was more a matter of, if you take the time to type it, I at least know you're not just copying and pasting from another source.
Right.
And I can certainly see the argument from we don't know how to combat plagiarism at this point, but we know that this at least helps us it buys us a little more time to figure it out.
Right. I will say, I'm convinced the teachers that wanted the font and size to look like a typewriter was just used to looking at typed papers and wanted to continue to see that.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure there was a certain level of I can scan this, mentally versus having to really pay attention and understand what I'm reading.
Her brain was trained to read papers that looked like that, or read papers for grading that were formatted in a particular way. So
we're certainly starting to digress from the
we are
the topic. Before we wrap up, is there anything else that you would like to specifically kind of address, or should we kind of give a final statement and move forward?
I mean, per usual, I'm stupidly optimistic about our future. Perhaps we'll get blindsided by something else. If you're familiar with the Fermi paradox, I'm fairly confident we're right in front of the great filter, which is the opposite of my MO.
Yeah, I think my viewpoint on it is kind of rooted in the realistic versus pessimistic versus optimistic debate. I'm hoping that we're transitioning to a better period, but I can't help but think of what I envision to be the worst case scenario and try to figure out what that means and what that looks like, and if there's anything I can do to help avoid it, because I can envision it. Like, that's kind of the whole point. It's if I can think it and envision it, I have to prepare for it.
Such a Gen X answer.
Yeah, I know. Well, it brings it full circle, though.
I know. I mean, it was perfect. Mine was like the same kind of answer, but wrapped in optimism. That will, an optimistic wrapper that will be quickly thrown away.
And the funny thing is, as a generally pessimistic person on a lot of topics, don't let go of the optimism. That's my one piece of advice.
Yeah.
Don't let go of the optimism.
And see, mine is like, be optimistic, but don't forget that, your optimism is usually
not rewarded.
Yeah. It's, approaching the same problem from two different ends.
Yeah. It is funny with the close proximity in general from age perspective and how that fits into development from a early childhood on. Just how different the approach could be over such a short time frame. Well, I think that's a show.
It is. Cue the outro. We have a number of different ways set up for you to get in touch with us to provide feedback, ask questions, or just comment in about something we've discussed.
You can hit us up on Twitter or Instagram at untitled_hosts, or shoot an email over to untitled.hosts@gmail.com.
Or get in touch directly with Jesse at jthart.com, or get in touch with me, John, via telepathy.
If you would like to support our work or are interested in listening to our new after show feed, head over to patreon.com/theUntitledPodcast and take a look at the options we have set up.
Thank you for listening.
We hope you've enjoyed the show.
And we hope to connect with more of you as we continue this journey.
That's a wrap.